Well, good morning, church family, and thank you for choosing to be with us today. It's hard to believe this is actually the final message in our Dangerous Prayer series. This is our 10th week, and I want to encourage you, if you maybe missed a couple or want to go back and revisit some of them, we have all of them on our YouTube channel. All you need to do is go to YouTube, punch in Oakbank Baptist Church into the search engine, and you will find it there. I'm recording this from my backyard on Saturday, September 5th, and a beautiful day out. Monica and I have been enjoying the sun today in the backyard, and we're thrilled that you've chosen to be with us this weekend. You know, J.B. Phillips wrote this excellent little book in 1952. I'm sure that I've talked about it in at least one of my prior messages. It was titled, "Your God is Too Small." And the whole idea behind this book was really very simple, and that's that all of us have created in our heads this mental image of what God is like. And in most cases, that image is simply not adequate to encompass him. It's simply not big enough. J.B. Phillips goes on in the book to talk about how some people see God as being like a parent. And some of us were even told as we were growing up that God was like our father. And that image works really well for those of us who have a loving, solid relationship with our earthly dads. It doesn't work so well for those people who didn't. J.B. Phillips goes on to mention some other mental pictures. He says, some see him as the resident policeman. Some see him as the grand old grandparent. Some see him as the managing director. Some see him as a God without personality who's really too big to care and too busy with the important things that are happening in the world to even notice us. And his list goes on and on. And he goes on in his book to suggest that most people are quick to put labels onto God. And maybe some of us are guilty of this as well. I mean, we might just catch ourselves at times saying things like, oh, you know, God is like this, or God is like that, or he can do this, but he can't do that. And in a sense, if we've said those things, we have put God, in some sorts anyways, into a confined and limited box. J.B. Phillips gives 15 common images we have of God, and then he goes on to tell us really why none of them are adequate to describe him. One of the many conclusions that he comes to in his book is that when we do define him as one of our mental metaphors, or when we do put him in this box, that really at that point, he no longer is God. He becomes at that point something that we have created inside our heads to help us better understand who we think God is and what he's like. He also concludes that most of us fail to grasp in our lives just how big God really is. And we have failed to think big enough about him because whatever metaphor we might have come up with, it's just simply not big enough. It's way too small. So let me begin this morning by asking you a question. The question is this: how big is your God? And the answer to that question will probably dictate your answer to this second question. What is the biggest prayer that you have ever prayed? These questions really are related because the size of your God will ultimately determine the size of your faith. And the size of your faith will ultimately determine the size of your prayer life. And as we wrap up our Dangerous Prayer series this week, it's easy for me anyways to look back on the prayers that we've been looking at and feel a sense of conviction, because one of the things that I've certainly walked away from this study with is that our prayers are just so often too small. And maybe, just maybe, that's because the mental picture that we've created in our heads of who God is, well, maybe that too is just too small. Well, today we're going to unpack a story from the book of Joshua, and I'm curious as to how many of you have actually heard this story before. I would bet that many of you are unfamiliar with it. But if you have your Bibles, I'm going to invite you to turn with me to Joshua chapter 10, because that's where we're going to camp out for most of the morning. And as you work your way through the whole book of Joshua, I mean, you realize very quickly that Joshua was really a remarkable young man. As a young man, he would have grown up as a slave in Egypt and all that entailed. As a young man, he would have watched firsthand as God used Moses, as God sent the plagues and literally brought Egypt to their knees. As a young man, he would have watched firsthand as Israel walked out of Egypt. And for the first time in over 400 years, they were a free people. I mean, can you imagine that? And it seems that almost from day one, there was something unique about Joshua. In fact, God spoke directly to Moses about him. And eventually, he became his right-hand man. And with all that, it's not surprising that before Moses died, he appointed Joshua to be his successor. We also know that Joshua was one of the 12 men who traveled to spy out the promised land. And in fact, he was one of the two that came back with this positive message that the God of Israel was big enough for the task at hand. While the 10 others said, nope, those bad guys, they're just too big and too strong for us. It was Joshua who at the Jordan put his feet in the water, and God honored his faith by stopping the floodwaters. And it was Joshua who was able to do things that even Moses wasn't able to accomplish. And we know that it was Joshua that ended up leading the Israelites into the promised land. And this morning, as we walk into chapter 10, we see that all that God had led Joshua through and all that God had taught him had created in Joshua this huge mental picture of who God was. And Joshua was going to need all of that for what was about to happen. So Joshua chapter 10, it starts off this way. Now Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had taken Ai and totally destroyed it, doing to Ai as its king as he had done to Jericho and its king, and that the people of Gibeon had made a treaty of peace with Israel and had become their allies. He and his people were very much alarmed at this because Gibeon was an important city, like one of the royal cities. It was larger than Ai, and all its men were good fighters. So Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, appealed to Hoham, king of Hebron, Param, king of Jermuth, Jephthah, king of Lushish, and Debar, king of Eglon. Come up and attack me, or come up and help me attack Gibeon, he said, because it has made peace with Joshua and the Israelites. Then the 5 king of the Amorites, and again it goes through their names, it says they moved up with their troops and took up positions against Gibeon and attacked it. So I know that there's a lot of information and a lot of things going on in those passages, but let me try and break it down for you, just what's going on there. Because the chapter opens with these 5 Amorite armies planning this attack on the Gibeonites. They had all joined forces to attack the Gibeonites because they were upset that they had made a treaty with Israel, and they were wanting to try and weaken that treaty by attacking them. So you can imagine that the Gibeonites quickly call on Israel for help, and Joshua responds immediately by sending his entire army. In fact, he took his army and immediately marched from Gilgal, which was where they were, to Gibeon, which was an uphill journey about 40 kilometers away. In fact, there was about a 3,300-foot difference in elevation between where they were and where they were headed. So it was all uphill. And it would have likely have taken them anywhere between 12 and 14 hours of walking to get there. This is how they asked Joshua for help, starting in verse 6. It says, the Gibeonites then sent word to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal, do not abandon your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us. Help us, because all the Amorite kings from the hill country have joined forces against us. Verse 7, so Joshua marched up from Gilgal with his entire army, including all the best fighting men. The Lord said to Joshua, do not be afraid of them. I have given them into your hand. Not one of them will be able to withstand you. So Joshua, our God gives Joshua and the nation of Israel this huge boost and this massive vote of confidence when he says, we've got this. Joshua, you're going to be victorious with this. Verse 9, after an all-night march from Gilgal, Joshua took them by surprise. The Lord threw them into confusion before Israel. So Joshua and the Israelites defeated them completely at Gibeon. So, okay, note this, because they've already won the fight. But Israel pursued them along the road going up to Beth Horon and cut them down all the way from Ezkah and Mekkedah. So, I want you to picture this with me, because Joshua and the Israelite army, they end up arriving, we're told, after this all-night 40-kilometer journey. And immediately, not taking a break to sort of regroup and catch their wind, but immediately they launch this surprise attack. The enemy lines are quickly broken, and the Amorites start to basically run away into this valleyed area down in the southwest towards Eskedah and Mekkedah. So again, I want you to imagine this with me, because Joshua and the Israelite army, they've completely overwhelmed the Amorites at Gibeon, and now they're just simply chasing down the remaining soldiers that are running away. And these soldiers that are running away are running for their lives, quite literally. We're told that they chased them along the road up to Beth Horon, and that they were cut down all the way to Hezekah and Mekkedah. We know that this was actually a full 25 miles from Gibeon. And even here we see that God directly intervenes, starting in verse 11. It says, as they fled before Israel on the road down from Beth Horon to Eskedah, the Lord hurled large hailstones down on them, and more of them died from the hail than were killed by the swords of Israelites. I mean, imagine that. Wow. So more soldiers, we're told, actually died from the hailstones that God threw down than actually died in the battle itself. And it's pointed out here in the original Hebrew. We don't really get this sense in our English translations, but we're told that the hail only killed the Amorites. So it's not as if this freak hailstorm hit the area and everyone was getting bombarded, but we're told that God was taking special aim and directing his onslaught at the Amorites only. But just in case you think that was the most incredible thing that had happened that night and day, just sit back and watch what God is about to do next. We're told that this chase was dragging on, and even though the Israelite army had obviously won, Joshua knew that when the sun would eventually set, that the darkness would come over the land, and that some of the Amorite soldiers that they were chasing would likely be able to escape because of the darkness. So the bottom line was that Joshua needed to buy some more time. Joshua knew that he needed to end all of this right there and then, and if he didn't, the likelihood of the armies regrouping was probably pretty good. So Joshua, in a sense, was desperate in this moment. So let's just pause there for a minute and ask the question, so what would you do in that moment? If I had been Joshua, and there would be I think there would be some wisdom in just simply letting the Amorites run away. I mean, everybody could plainly see that Joshua and the Israelite army and the God of Israel had won this battle. And they must have thought, we've already killed most of our enemies. Maybe that's enough. I mean, God's just killed off a bunch of the Amorites with these huge hailstones. What else do we have to prove? And after all, my men have marched for 40 kilometers all night with their full gear on. They fought the battle at Gibeon, and then they've chased down the remaining soldiers another 25 miles. And man, they must have been exhausted. I wonder if Joshua didn't think, maybe we should just call it a day and celebrate the victory that we have obviously won. But that's not what Joshua did. And it's at this point that Joshua utters what might be the most audacious prayer in all of Scripture. Because in this critical moment of decision, this is what happens. This is the dangerous prayer that Joshua speaks, starting in verse 12. It says, on the day the Lord gave the Amorites over to Israel, Joshua said to the Lord in the presence of Israel, sun, stand still over Gibeon, and you, moon, over the valley of Ajalon. So did you catch what he actually asked for there? And what happened? Verse 13. So the sun stood still and the moon stopped until the nation avenged itself on its enemies, as it is written in the book of Jeshar. The sun stopped in the middle of the sky and delayed the going down about a full day. Verse 14, there has never been a day like it before or since, a day when the Lord listened to a human being. Surely the Lord was fighting for Israel. So in short, Joshua said, Lord, stop the sun. And if you think that that prayer was incredible, I think it's equally as incredible that God actually answered it. And he answered it promptly, like right away. Now, on a bit of a side note here, there's a lot of different opinions about what this book of Jashar is that's talked about in this passage. And some believe that it's a poetic book of poems and songs that really honored some of Israel's strongest leaders, a copy of which was actually found in the 16th century. And while some believe that what was found in the 16th century was original, there's others who don't. Some believe it was a fake. But either way, the name Jashnar in Hebrew means the book of the upright, or the book of the just man. And it's referred to in the book of Joshua, as well as the book of 2 Samuel, and in the book of 1 Kings. But what I don't want us to miss here is that God has miraculously chose to intervene twice in this battle. The first time he sent the hailstones in verse 11. The second time by delaying the sun from going down, we're told, for what was a full day. God did the first on his own initiative. He did the second in response to Joshua's prayer. And in that moment, again, I wonder how many of us would have prayed for that. I wonder how many of us would have just simply thanked God for the victory, even though the battle wasn't won, and turned around and gone home. And you know, it's a good reminder to us, because maybe you're here dealing with a situation and you can almost see the ending of it, and there's this tendency to want to take your foot off the gas pedal. I wonder if that's not where Joshua was at, because as the battle was winding down and he saw that all of his men were exhausted from fighting, I wonder if there wasn't the tendency to think, well, maybe my job is finished. But the job wasn't finished. And he asked God for what he needed to finish strong. In fact, if the sun goes down, that would mean that it would be a longer battle, right? I mean, and according to the text, they fought for a full another day, a full 24 hours longer. Because of that, Joshua fought to finish the task at hand. I also think that there's something else going on here, and it likely isn't obvious from the text. But the Amorite people were what we would call polytheistic. I know that that's a big word, but it basically means that their religion believed in many different gods. I mean, they had a different god for all kinds of different things. They had these huge statues built for these gods. They had buildings that they constructed and dedicated to the gods. People had little figurines in their homes that were shaped in the likenesses of these gods. They had places where they would go to worship and make sacrifices to these gods. But you know, with all of the gods that they had, there were two that were seen as the most prominent gods. There were two that were seen as being responsible for all of the other ones. And one was represented by the sun, and one was represented by the moon. And you have to wonder if that didn't play a part in why Joshua chose to ask for what he did, and why God was so quick to reply. Because Joshua wasn't just wanting to end the battle. I think that Joshua and God wanted to make this huge statement about whose God was the only true, powerful God. It's also interesting to note that Joshua's dangerous prayer, it wasn't said in the quietness of a tent, like the prayer from Moses' prayer that we looked at last week. Joshua's prayer, as we read in verse 12, It says, on the day the Lord gave the Amorites over to Israel, Joshua said, said to the Lord in the presence of Israel. In the presence of Israel, he said this, sun stand still over Gibeon, and you, moon, over the valley of Ajalon. I mean, Joshua asked God in the presence of everybody to send this bold statement to everybody that the God of Israel is all-powerful, and he will even halt the sun and the moon if it will help to accomplish his greater purpose. Joshua asked God to halt a process that he had put in place right at the beginning of the creation of the world. He asked God to stop the sun from setting for a full 24 hours. And I'm not sure if you'd agree with this, but I think a prayer like that takes guts. I mean, it takes guts to ask for something like that. It takes a certain amount of craziness to believe that God would actually choose to answer a prayer like that. Is that true? But it also takes someone who knows that God is not defined by the limited box that we as his followers so often choose to put him in. I would love to have seen the look on the Israelite army's faces when those words came off Joshua's lips. I mean, I wonder if they were looking at each other saying, okay, this guy's finally lost it. Were they wondering if he had actually maybe come down with heat stroke, or he was so exhausted from all this traveling that maybe he was just saying things that he didn't even know what was coming out of his mouth? Maybe some of them thought that he had actually been hit in the head by one of those big hailstones. But it was none of that. What caused Joshua to say all that was that he hadn't created a mental metaphor of who God was. Joshua had made the decision not to put God in a box. Joshua in his life had seen God do so much around him that he thought, why not this? Taking it back to those questions that we asked earlier, I really do wonder, how big is your God? What's the biggest prayer that you have ever prayed for? It's true that the size of your God will determine the size of your faith, and the size of your faith will determine the size of your prayer life. Joshua wasn't afraid to make the big ask because that was consistent with the size of his God. There's so much that we can learn from this passage, but the big takeaway for us this morning is simply this. I mean, maybe it's time for us to rethink our mental picture of who we think God is. Maybe you and I, maybe we've kept him stuffed in this manageable sized box long enough. Maybe our mental metaphor has done nothing but limit what we will even ask him to do. Maybe it's time for us to do away with our timid, wimpy prayers and start getting dangerous with them. My friends, the size of your God will determine the size of your faith, and the size of your faith will determine the size of your prayer life. Lord bless.